Welcome to Career in Ruins, where, according to ChatGPT, this week we will be unraveling the mysteries and discoveries that shape the fascinating realms of archaeology.
Chat GPT.
Yeah, mate, you want to be sending that around to your students?
I know. That was my day today. A lecture on generative AI and what is AI literacy. It was it was an interesting one. So someone asked me last week what our institutional position on AI is, and I still don't know. I've given an hour lecture on it today, and I'm still not 100% sure where any of us stand.
Maybe you could ask ChatGPT to tell you what your institutional position should be on AI.
I did. I did. It was quite positive. It also, I also got it to write its own introduction, which was I just made me sound a bit like a twat, to be honest.
It's pretty clever then. It knows what it's doing.
Yeah, it was a good life lesson for the students. But no, it was a fun day, and I've been lucky this semester. Well, I don't know if lucky is the right word. I've not had a huge amount of teaching this semester because I've mostly been doing admin. So it was nice to get back in the lecture theatre and have some fun. And I taught it along with our dear colleague Prof Gillings, who was in there heckling me the whole time. So it's a really nice day.
Sounds like a great day. Oh, how you been? Last time I saw you, we were both in ridiculous outfits and watching hundreds of students walk past us on a stage.
I was wondering where you were going with that story. The last time I saw you was 2 a.m. in Bournemouth after graduation.
Yeah, that was,
it was a treat. It was a treat. Honestly, one of my favourite days of the year, graduation. I mean, it feels like only yesterday because I was sort of sickening for what may or may not be COVID or the flu at the time. So we had a great big fun day, watched loads of students graduate, had a really nice after party with some bubbly, then went out, had a lovely evening, blew some cobwebs out a little bit, and then I didn't wake up for about 4 days. So it's nice to see you again so soon.
Living your best life. I'm glad you could bring yourself back to record a Career in Ruins. It's good to see where your priorities have
just about made it back. How about you? What have you been up to?
I'm good. Well, obviously that was a lovely day, and it was so lovely to see so many inspirational individuals, people we work closely with, like Hayden, Scott Pratt, and Siggy, who both received awards for their masters,
university awards.
Yeah,
best students in the university.
Yeah,
don't mind that.
And some brilliant undergrads as well. Which Tash, I think, who was on our Career in Ruins in the Field episode. So lovely to see her getting her undergraduate degree, and so many just brilliant and enthusiastic and bright-faced early careers individuals. So huge congratulations to them and anyone else around the country that's going through graduation at the moment. It's something to be super proud of, and we're looking forward to seeing you all on a Career in Ruins episode in the future in some shape or form. But other than that, I've been out in Norfolk for a few days. The last couple of days, I've been mooching around Thetford Forest and talking to people around best practice in forestry archaeology, but then also looking at some pretty interesting sites.
That sounds interesting. Any sites in particular?
Yeah, well, a few interesting ones. There's some lovely rabbit warrens to look at. There was a medieval cross that was along a pilgrim's way, which was very cool. Just now in the middle of a lovely beech forest, but presumably would have been quite an open landscape once upon a time. So that was quite interesting. And then loads of round barrows, one of which was an absolute stonker. I mean, I couldn't tell you, maybe 100 meters in diameter. It was huge, big bell barrow, bigger than anything I've seen out in that region before. And actually, in the discussions, it was described as the Silbury Hill of Thetford.
Silbury Hill. It's funny you should mention Silbury Hill, Lawrence.
Oh, why is that, Eric?
Yeah, because our guest today has actually done some excavations there today. As you know, really, we are joined by the incredible Dr. Jim Leary, who works at the University of York, is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. I can never say that, and I'm not even going to edit it. I'm just going to leave it in as it is. Who, as I've said, led excavations at Silbury Hill and Mardenhenge, but recently has published the book Footmarks: A Journey into Our Restless Past, which shamefully I've not read yet, But the website ensures me it's a book full of engaging, authoritative, and fascinating stories of the past, showing that the human past is shaped by restless movement along tracks and trails. And some Amazon reviewers have described it as a guaranteed mood lifter, or a lyrical and occasionally humorous prose. Also, one reviewer, was delighted that the book taught me a new word. Jim, help me. What does that mean?
And again, sorry, did you sneeze there? I know you got
Cytherus. It's the kind of the gentle whisper of wind through the leaves of a tree, you know, that sort of.
Ooh.
Yeah. These, you know, and like petrichor, which is the smell of like fresh earth after it's rained for the first time in a while. These things that we see all the time as archaeologists, they have words, it turns out.
Amazing.
I mean,
I've just learned a new word.
So is this a career in ruins first, where someone might learn something listening to the
podcast? Well, certainly someone, I know most, I guess, will teach our listeners a bit, whereas we don't. But yeah, that's another discussion. Jim, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's so lovely to see you. And it's a real pleasure to have you along and to share your career in ruins story with us. So I wonder if you could just kick us off by giving us an overview of your career in ruins to date.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. It really is. I've listened to your podcasts and you know, seen you guys in action all the time, and I could just sit here and watch you two chat. It's like an episode of Staged from where I'm from where I'm stood. So yeah, I suppose my career, how long have you got? 25 years.
We'll give you a minute per year.
So yeah, well, I mean, like most archaeologists, I guess it started off with a very sort of early love of the past and that sort of thing. I spent a lot of my childhood in foreign countries, actually, because my parents, well, my father worked for the airlines, so we did a lot of traveling around, and my mother did as originally as well. But we traveled all over the world, and we lived in various places, and one of those places was Cyprus. And we were young, and my older brother produced a great big lump of amphora from the sea on one occasion. Absolutely, you know, amazing. We used to spend our days just sort of swimming around and snorkeling and things, and this had obviously been washed out of something and then washed up, and it was kind of one of those moments of oh my goodness, this is real, you know. And what really sort of grabbed me was that on the very top of the, you know, these amphoras have these great big handles, and on the very top of it was a thumbprint. And obviously the maker, you know, presumably when the amphora had just been made and hadn't been fired yet, had sort of picked it up and left a thumbprint in it. And it just, you know, it's one of those moments that people talk about all the time, and you think, nah, that's not real. But it was, you know, it was that one of those moments that sends an electric shock through you. That's amazing. This connection to someone else. And we used to find these bits of pottery in our back garden, you know, all over, little sherds all over the place. And so I sort of always had a kind of a love for it. And then when we came back to England for a while, I would do exactly the same thing again, but I'd walk the dog. And as I was walking, I'd be looking at the ground, at these ploughed fields around me, and started to realise that there were pieces of struck flint. And of course, I didn't know what they were or what you were meant to be doing with them. But in this sort of schoolboy way, I would collect them. And you know, I now know that what I was looking at was actually a fairly vast late Mesolithic site with lots and lots of sort of flakes and a couple of microliths that had been sort of moved by the plough up into the plough soil. But I used to sort of collect these things, and I used to mark with a little cross on a map where I found them. And then one day I found an arrowhead. It's amazing. I wish I had it here to show you over Zoom. I put it up on Twitter a while ago. It's this beautiful leaf-shaped arrowhead, absolutely wafer thin. You can hold it up to the light and see the light straight, you know, come straight through it. It's just, again, it's one of those moments where I realised that was looking at something that was a proper tool. It wasn't just sort of a bit of rubbish that I was making up, but actually something. And again, it was this sort of spark, and it just gave me this lifelong, absolutely lifelong love of archaeology and finding things. So it came from there really, and then talking to my history teachers at school and realizing that there was such a thing as archaeology, because I didn't really know that. Realizing that Indiana Jones was an archaeologist, which I hadn't quite clocked even at that stage, excited me even more. So I then thought, do you know what, this is what I want to do at university. So I applied to Cardiff University and was interviewed, and got a place there and packed my bags and off I went. My parents had already moved out to Hong Kong or China or some by that stage. So I was sort of my older brother gave me a lift up, and I just loved it. I was one of these people that wasn't very academic at school. I wasn't very good at school. I didn't like it very much. I found it very sort of closeting and stifling. And I didn't do terribly well, but I did okay enough to get into Cardiff University, obviously. And it was, some point during I don't know, the first year, I think, at Cardiff, and it just struck me that this is the career. This is what I want. And I did really, I started doing quite well. I started getting essays that were like 75, 76%. And I was thinking, my goodness, this is it. So that's where it started from. It's this sort of, childhood love, this boyish or girlish, this sort of, childish fascination with finding things, which I think is, this curiosity, which I think exists in all of us. It's the same curiosity that means little kids kind of peer into rock pools and things like that. Archaeologists, really, all we're doing is just peering into rock pools that sort of little windows into the past, aren't they? And you just want to see what's there. Just what's there. I just want to know. I just want to look underneath that bit of soil. I want to find out what that lump and that bump is. So yeah, so that's where it came from. And then I realised whilst I wasn't very clued up, I must admit, but I realised at some point during my degree that there's such a thing as commercial archaeology, and that you can actually get paid to do this, and that blew me away. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to do this. So I originally had a place to stay on at Cardiff and do a research masters with Alistair Whittle, and I was going to, I was thinking, well, maybe this is what I'll do. I'll become an academic and do. And then I found out that I could go off and get paid to do it. So I thought I chucked all that in and went off to London and worked in development-led archaeology. And I had just the most amazing time there, digging loads of different sites. I've always been interested in prehistory, and that's sort of where my love came from. And you don't get huge amounts of it. We don't tend to find that much of it in London. It's mostly medieval and Roman stuff. But what we were, and some really nice Saxon stuff actually. But what we were finding was amazing. And within a year there, I was supervising, and then in a few years, I was supervising big sites in the city of London, and yeah, I just sort of turned my back on academic archaeology and thought this is the bee's knees. And slowly over the years, I kind of worked my way up towards the end. I was actually project managing, and then one day it struck me that I was no longer doing archaeology. I was kind of phoning up Portaloo companies and arguing over day rates for them and things like this, or organising them to be cleaned for other people. And I thought, wait a second, this is not what I signed up for. So a job came up at English Heritage, and I applied and was very, very lucky to get that. And it was back when English Heritage and Historic England were one organisation. This was back in 2005, and I got the job as the prehistorian down in Fort Cumberland, and yeah, dug some amazing sites from there, really amazing sites. And it took me a number of years to realise that actually I was ready now to come back into academia. So I excavated some fantastic sites. Silbury Hill is one of them, and Mardenhenge, another one. It's really, really fantastic, internationally important sites. But after a while, I thought I would like to go back and teach. So I got a job at Reading, and then subsequently, a few years later, a job lecturing at York. So that's where I am. And I've never lost that fascination for the past, that curiosity, that love of finding things. That's always stayed with me. And I remember when I first started in development-led archaeology, and somebody sat in the pub and said to me, I just said, "Oh, I love it. I'm so passionate about this subject, and I'm really pleased to be here." And they said, "Don't worry, that will go. You'll be jaded soon." And I'm just, I just feel the luckiest person alive that I've never been jaded by it. I've never been a big fan of cynics. You see it all the time, actually. You see it even in young people. They've kind of developed a certain cynicism. It's very easy to be cynical. It's really hard to be positive and passionate all the time. That's where the real true graft comes from. Being cynical and casually negative about stuff is dead easy. But I've never lost that passion for it. I've never lost the drive to find out more, and I've never lost that curiosity. And I don't think I ever will now, to be honest with you. As I am knocking on the door at 50, I'm hopefully, I will carry that through for the rest of my career. And as we know, archaeologists never retire, so probably for the rest of my life.
That's amazing, Jim. Thank you so much. And what I love about that is you just captured the essence of what Career in Ruins is all about. There's a certain type of person that gets invited to Career in Ruins, and it's the people that ooze that enthusiasm and identify how easy it is to be cynical and or not passionate, but as you say, that people that feel lucky enough to be able to identify that they love it enough, and but also driven enough to fuel that enthusiasm and make the most of that enthusiasm and ride that luck, whatever luck is, based on a more recent podcast that might have come out. But what I particularly love about your career is that I think is quite unique to what we've seen so far on the podcast over the last 4 years or so, is that you've got a really nice stint in commercial archaeology, so developer-led archaeology, curatorial archaeology, sort of working with Historic England, looking after the nation's significant archaeological record, doing research, feeding into decision-making, policy, etc. And then the academic side of it is which you're in now. And obviously each of those have similarities, but they all have quite big differences, both in a positive and a negative scenario. I wonder if you've got any quick reflections on the sort of differences between those careers.
Yeah, I mean they're completely different careers in a sense, and archaeology remains the theme through it, but they're doing different things. I mean, I absolutely loved my time in London. That was really that for me. That was where I cut my teeth. That's where I learned the craft of archaeology. Digging day in, day out, whatever the weather and all the rest of it. But it's a fundamentally different thing to then working at English Heritage, which is quite a lot more public facing. The monuments are in public public guardianship, and they're sort of a more bigger scale than I was used to before. My timetable and the sites I was looking at was no longer driven by the developer, but by yourself. We could at the time, at least, there was money to actually develop research projects and say, actually, we need to know a bit more about sites in this area, so we're planning this and this. And take it right the way through to conclusion. So they're completely different things. And then again, universities are completely different. I could be teaching, I don't know, accountancy or something, or zoology, and it would be largely the same as the sort of job that I have now, which is, as well as Derek will know, at universities, it's largely administrative, and then you try and fit in sort of teaching and research around that. It's kind of to me, universities were a little bit like you're being asked to do something. You go, oh yeah, I can do that. That's within my skill set. And then you get there and they say, but we're not going we don't want you to do that. We actually want you to do this, this, and this. You go, that's not within my skill set at all. Don't care. Keep going. And then they say, and then you start doing those. You think, oh yeah, I'm getting into a groove. I can probably do this. And then they say, yeah, but we've got this brass band, and we're going to march it around you, and it's going to blow its trombone in your ear, and it's going to clap its cymbals in your face, and it's going to keep doing that. And you can't drop the ball. You have to carry on doing exactly what you're doing, and you've got to be the best, because at the same time, everyone's going to be doing surveys and writing remarks about you and scaling you and scoring you, and by the end of it, you're kind of, your nerves jangle and you feel frazzled. So university again is a really fundamentally different thing, but you have to, we're teaching the next generation, so you've got to keep that passion. You kind of have to black out all of that, or blank out all of that other stuff, and just remain focused. Our job now is to teach that next generation, to pass on the baton, to give them that passion, and to make them realize that they don't have to be cynical. They can just be really passionate and positive, and that's okay.
I must admit, I don't think I can think of a conversation we've had with someone over the last however many years we've been doing this podcast where so much of what you said has resonated with me from beginning to end, right the way back to not being particularly academic before you went to uni and studied archaeology. I mean, I was exactly the same. I failed miserably at A levels before going to university, and suddenly getting top grades. It's like, this is brilliant. This is great. This is such a different way of thinking, different way of doing, and it inspired me in such a similar way. And yeah, I'll leave the academic comparisons because I think you've covered it perfectly well there. But before we hit record, you mentioned your latest career move, which I must admit, as you were telling us, I was incredibly envious of, I think, and we'll get back to envy a bit later. But it's a really big leap to go from the kind of the academic grind. Is again another big leap in your career to go from the academic grind of, as you say, admin, the joy of teaching, the joy of helping the next generation through, trying to get publications out for other academics to read and judge you on, and all of that malarkey, to actually writing a book that someone outside of our discipline might want to read. And that's something I'm so I can't think of, in awe of, I think, of that ability to shift to that medium and tell a story. And I can't wait to read it. I've just downloaded the Audible version, in fact, and that's going to be my commute for the next week. I mean, you told us before the podcast, but if you're happy to share that with our listeners as well, how you go from the job you were in terms of a full-time academic post at York to being an author.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I've been driven by this desire to understand movement and particularly walking in archaeology. It's something that I've been just absolutely captivated by for the last 15 or so years. I've edited volumes on it, and I've run tag sessions and various things on the subject. And the more I've learned, the more passionate I've become about this subject of walking, footprints, footsteps, paths, roads, big journeys, sailing, but big migrations, and all the amazing stuff that's coming out of archaeology right now, this kind of ancient DNA and so on. So I wrote all the kind of, I wrote an antiquity article with my dear colleague Martin Bell last year or a couple of years ago, whenever it was. And, so I feel like I've kind of done the academic stuff for the archaeology of movement and walking. But what I wanted to do was kind of, there's a real, I mean, in non-fiction narrative publishing, there's loads and loads of books about walking, and Robert Macfarlane has been amazing and really sort of trailblazed, to use a pun, sort of an entire audience that want to read about paths and things like that. And I wanted to do that, but I wanted to do it from an archaeological point of view. And the trouble I have with, I love nature writing. It's my genre and my literary genre. It's what I read to feel to comfort myself, to feel comfortable, to relax. I read nature writing. And it's always, it uses archaeology quite often, but what it tends to do is refer to it in a very passive sort of a way and a not very scholarly sort of way. And then it sort of falls back into then kind of making these sort of grand sweeping statements based on that. And I think, no, archaeology is so much more. And the real archaeology is actually really, really exciting. Tell the public deserve to know more about archaeology. So it was, having sort of done all this academic stuff about, the archaeology of writing, I then wanted to write this book on the archaeology of movement and walking and stuff for a broader audience. And so I sat down and I did that, and I wrote the book, and I drafted it, and I wrote about 15, 16 different drafts of it. And I got the book that I really enjoyed, and I thought, this is going to be good. And eventually I got an agent after maybe, I don't know, 20 rejections from publishing companies, publishing houses, sending it to various agents on spec saying, hey, would you publish a book? And all of them, the ones that bothered to reply to me, they sort of said the same thing, which is, oh, it sounds good, and there's this is sort of an area that sells quite well generally, but archaeology, I'm afraid, is a bit of a deadening subject, which was just like a knife to my heart. And I was like, what? This is just, this is not right. So anyway, eventually I was put in touch with my wonderful agent, who keeps his head down, and so I won't mention his name just in case he doesn't want it mentioned. And he said, this is great, Jim. This is, it's a nice, well polished book. You now need to go back to the beginning and basically rewrite it, because you assume people know what a henge is. You assume this. You talk about that. You've got academic words in here. Da, 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 da. And so I was very lucky to have some study leave, and took study leave and just sat down and reworked this thing. And was put in touch with the wonderful Jean-Paul Flintoff, another writer who also does editing, and he helped me. And he was like, basically, this chapter, Jim, you need to chop it up. It's lots of different chapters, and then let's reorder it, and it's going to look like this. Now do that for the rest of the book. And it's kind of this lesson on, it's a masterclass really, on how to write narrative non-fiction for the wider public, for the trade market, and not for academic colleagues. And I learned so much, and it just got to the end of it, and I was so exhausted, but it was just so absolutely wonderful. And the book has just been so, the publisher's Icon produced a book which I can't, I just could never have imagined writing, something that's so beautiful. And it had been really well received, and I thought, what, I want to do more of this. This is firing up, this is firing all of my pistons, and I want to do, I've got more. There are loads more stories out there, and so I made the decision. The university were kind of going through changes. We were moving from 3 terms a year to 2 semesters a year, which meant sort of complete reconfiguration of our teaching and all the modules and all the rest of it. And I just thought, during this period of change, actually, I'm going to do something that I've always wanted to do. And I was spurred on by my wife, who just kept saying to me, do it now. This is your chance to do it. So I said to them, please, I'd like to go part-time. But I don't want to do just a few days a week, a few days on, a few days off a week, because I think work can easily creep into that. What I want to do is have 1 semester off and then work the next semester. And so, and thankfully, it was all agreed. I went through the university channels, and so now I work part-time. So I write for 6 months of the year, and then I teach for 6 months of the year. And I mean, apart from just, the panic I have when I see my pay packet once a month and realize that this sacrifice is, almost unbearable, but it's so worthwhile. And I just have loved it. So I've just spent the last semester writing the next book. Actually, anyway, I won't go into the debate. 1 book has actually turned into 2. So I've got these kind of 2 books going at the same time at the moment. Not quite sure how it's all going to work out. I'm at that kind of grappling stage. And then after the new year, I'll be going back to do 6 months of teaching, which I'm really looking forward to. I've got a whole new module on the Neolithic of Britain and Ireland, which I'm really looking forward to teaching. And then once that's over, back to my writing. try and nail what these books actually are. And it just feels like it feels like that brass band that I was talking about earlier has gone. I've silenced them somehow, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I can actually think, and it's just wonderful. Really is wonderful. It's a privilege, absolute privilege, and I know it's a privilege, and I don't, I respect that privilege every single day.
That's brilliant, 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 brilliant. And the book, I think, is something to be super proud of, not least for the beautiful cover, but the fantastic content that's found within it. And then look forward to seeing what comes out of the next 6 months of writing for these next two books. So as I say, that's something to be very proud of, and I think I'm going to give you a free pass on that. But as most listeners will know, we have our first or second question after the overview of your career in ruins is something you've done to date that you're particularly proud of. So if we put the book aside, unless you really want to talk about the book again, but what of that career that spans quite a substantial amount of time, is there one standout project that you're particularly proud of?
Yes, there is actually. And I suppose, I suppose probably the most famous or the best known site that I've done is Silbury Hill. And we had again, that was what an incredible privilege that was, to lead a team of archaeologists into the middle of Silbury Hill. We were there for we were on site almost for a year, actually, just digging in it and on it. And how amazing to spend so much time with such a wonderful monument, such a monument that has seeped deep into my very, very bones, so that it feels like a part of me. And I loved that site. I loved it more than words, more than I can explain. It just is, it feels like it was it is the most defining part of my career, and I think it probably will always remain the defining site of my career. But it's not the one that I'm the proudest of, because.
But just quickly, Jim, sorry to interrupt, but for those people that may not know what Silbury Hill is, because we've got people that listen across the country. I mean, it's a pretty spectacular site. It's this giant prehistoric mound found within the Avery World Heritage Site. Why don't you give us a quick overview of the headlines?
Yeah, it's an extraordinary monument. It's a mound. It looks like an upturned pudding bowl. It's 31 meters high, making it the largest prehistoric earthen monument in Europe, actually, and actually just slightly taller than the very tallest Mississippian mounds in the US, the Cahokian mounds. It's vast, it's huge, and it's a massive enigma. But a whole series of antiquarian digging. So there were all sorts of stories that there were sort of gold statues and various things in the middle of it. And so antiquarians dug into it, and all of these had destabilized the monument, particularly a BBC sponsored excavation in the 60s, which we now know nothing to do with the BBC. Actually, the Ministry of Works paid for somebody to backfill it, and we now know that they didn't. They basically took the money and ran. They only backfilled the very final 2 meters of the tunnel. The rest was left open. And what that meant is, over the following decades, it kind of, the chalk frittered down into these tunnels, and slowly that made its way to the summit of this hill, and a hole appeared on the top. And then so archaeologists were brought back in, English heritage archaeologists were brought in to reopen that tunnel with engineers and miners, and basically record it, but then stabilize the thing, which is what we did. So so yes, it's an amazing monument, well worth going to see. You can't go up it, but you can stand at its foot, and you can, wonder how 4,500 years ago, with no metals, only with antler picks and shoulder blade shovels, people actually built this thing. It'd be a task nowadays with all of our technology, let alone then. Anyway, so I was very privileged to lead the team of archaeologists in 2007 and 2008 to do that work. Whilst I was there, I was staying at Marlborough, which is the nearby town, and I was driving down the A4 to Silbury Hill, to the site every day, and every day I would pass another big mound known as the Marlborough Mound, which actually sits within Marlborough College, the public school. And every day I'd look at it, I thought, oh, that looks just like a smaller version of Silbury Hill. We know that it was a medieval motte because it had it was a good historic records that had a tower and it was used as a motte and all the rest of it. But I kept the question of, but was it originally a Neolithic mound like Silbury Hill? Kept kind of bouncing back into my mind. So when we finished the work at Silbury Hill, I got in contact with the Marlborough College, and they put me in touch with a wonderful group of people called the Marlborough Mound Trust. And I spoke to them and I said, do you know, I've just finished the work at Silbury Hill down the road. I would love to know the date of your mound. And they said, yes, well, so would we. How would we go about doing that? And we're not going to put a tunnel into the middle. And I was like, no, we're not going to put a tunnel. The tunnel into Silbury was, multiples of millions of pounds to do that work, £2 or £3 million to do that work. So we're not going to do that. And they said, well, how are we going to get dates from it? And I said, well, I wonder whether if we were to drill a core, just to like a 10 centimetre diameter core down from the summit right the way through the mound, and the core material comes out in these sort of 1 meter lengths, which you can then mark up and take off and analyze. And if there's any charcoal within that, we will be able to get some radiocarbon dates on that and get a date on the mound. And they're, oh, that's a brilliant idea. Okay, well, we'll pay for it. How shall we go about doing this? So I put them in touch with a company, Geoarchaeology, that did the cores. And they said, how much do you think it's going to cost to do this work? And I said, well, I don't know. It's probably, I was just making up at this stage. I said, probably £1,000 per core. Let's do 2 cores. Let's call it £2,000. And they said, well, fine, we'll do that. That's great. Yeah, bargain. And so anyway, I got a phone call about a week later. Chap on the other end of the phone said, we've got the quote back, and it's £24,000 to do this work. And what I hadn't realised was, because the mound is surrounded by college buildings, school buildings, they actually had to, because it's so big, they need a crane to put the coring machine on the top, but they had to dismantle the crane to bring it in, and then they had to reassemble it, and then they had to do the same to take it. And as soon as they said that, I said, do you know what? Actually, it's a pig in a poke. We don't know whether we're going to get it. It's a needle in a haystack. So let's forget the whole thing. And they said, no, we're into it now. You've got us excited, so we're going to go ahead. We've already booked them, for the next half term. So they did. So the cores went in. I took them back down to Fort Cumberland. Matt Canty analysed the cores. He managed to get out 6 good pieces of charcoal. We radiocarbon dated it, and we were able to show that the Marlborough Mound was originally a Neolithic mound, so the same date as Silbury Hill. Now that to me was just the most extraordinary period of time. We put out a press release and it just went wild. I was being interviewed by Al Jazeera television and various mad places, and so that's what I'm proudest of, because the reason is because I loved Silbury, and it's like I say, it's attached to my soul now. But Silbury Hill would have still been done if I didn't exist. Silbury Hill would have been done by someone else. The Marlborough Mound came from me, and that's for me my proudest moment.
Perfect. And I, sort of, before I get to the next question, that's given me a very enviable moment. It's a moment to envy. I mean, to have put that on the map, to have given it the character, the identity, that is such an amazing thing to have in your CV, and I'm incredibly envious. Speaking of envy, we always follow up our pride question with envy. So is looking around at your colleagues, friends, people you know, people in the profession, people in the history of the discipline, is there anything out there in the world of archaeology you're particularly envious of?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, academics kind of get envy all the time, it seems to me. And it's part of this kind of, cynical nature to be envious. So I try not to be too envious. Your successes are my successes and all the rest of it. I suppose, I mean, to answer your question, I think the one site that's kind of eluded me, is I've worked on amazing monuments, henge monuments, monumental mounds. I've excavated an early Neolithic timber hall, stuff that many people are probably quite envious of themselves. But they're all monuments. I focused on monuments, which is probably that because I was working for English Heritage, and I suppose the site that's eluded me a little bit is these kind of really amazingly well preserved waterlogged sites. I don't know, Must Farm, is the go-to one, and that jumps out. And I mean, yeah, I don't know if I'm envious because I'm really pleased that it was done, and I'm really pleased that Mark Knight was the guy that did it. I'm not sure I would have been. I don't know if I'm actually good enough to do something like that. But that was an extraordinary site, and this is a Bronze Age, very well preserved Bronze Age village with the Bronze Age building still surviving and the stuff inside the building still surviving, right down to coils of thread and all the bowls and a wooden bowl with sort of porridgey type stuff in it and a spoon sticking out. Just the stuff that dreams are made of in archaeology. And I want a bit of that action. Not that side, that's done. And I'm pleased, like I say, I'm not so envious that I wanted to do it because I don't think I could have done as good a job as Mark did. So I'm just glad that it was found, and I'm glad that it was done so well, and I'm glad we know so much about it, and I can't wait to see the publication that comes, the final big publication. But yeah, if I do get these rushes of envy when I see these really well preserved peatland sites. So that's in my target now. I'm working in Holderness. This is a huge gap in archaeological study, and it's full of peat and it's full of well preserved stuff. And we did a very nice site there earlier this year, and we're going back next year. And we had little forays out into the peat. And we were getting things like dragonfly wings still iridescent, and beautiful beetles and beetle shells and stuff still sort of flashing green at you. And so we got some wonderful stuff. It promises to be amazing. So that's where I'm hoping to find my Must Farm there.
There's a few nice takeaways there. One, I like, again, it still feels there's an element there that you're driving your own destiny. You like the idea of a wetland waterlog site, so you're going out to get yourself a nice wetland waterlog site, which is what Career in Ruins all about, sort of carving out your own destiny in those areas and whatnot, which is great. And I also like, it occurred to me that a lot of the sites you mentioned and a lot of the work you've done to date in your career, certainly from Historic England onwards, it's been big monumental archaeology, landscape archaeology. But what kicked it all off was a lump of amphora and a tiny little arrowhead, and that sort of circularity of our discipline, that everything's equally as important and can shape anything, and you can't have one without the other, which is lovely. Jim, we're rattling towards the end of the podcast now, and our final question, as ever, is we'd love to give you some free tickets on our fully functioning time machine, and all we need to know is where you'd like to take it and what you'd like to see.
Oh, well, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to this one. Now, if I may, this may not be within the rules, but I'd like to go back into the past. But if I may, I'd like to stop off on the way and save my brother who died in a car crash, and just catch him, and just 12th of November, anniversary's just gone, 6:30 in the morning, 2003. I'd like just 5 minutes before catch him with there, and just stop the car, stop him. Having done that and playing this game, I'll then go back into the deep past, which is where I'd like to go. And yeah, I mean, would I want to go back to see Silbury Hill being made? No, I'd like to go back further, please. I'd like to go back to the very beginning of the Neolithic, right at the end of the Mesolithic, and I want to be. So I would like to be somewhere around 4100 BCE. And I would like to see the first early pioneer farmers sailing across the Channel and up the Thames estuary. And I'd like to be with them, and I'd like to see them sitting in these boats, whatever the boats were. We don't know because we've never found one. Maybe, presumably these massive sort of coracle type things, but big enough to fit trussed up animals and cattle and sheep and goats and pouches of seed corn that they brought with them and their polished axes. And I'd like to see them settle in essentially what was an occupied hunter-gatherer, thickly wooded island, because by that stage Britain and Ireland were islands, no longer attached to the continent. And I'd like to see them hew out their own new life as farmers or sort of hunter gardener type people in essentially a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer world, clearing their first bit of woodland and growing their first corn, growing that first crop on this island, and presumably watched over, peeking out from behind trees by some slightly confused hunter-gatherers, who, of course, themselves will no doubt have interacted with farmers across the Channel anyway, so they probably would know what's going on. But just to see that very first step in Britain and Ireland becoming Neolithic, that very, very early days, and set the trend for changing, set the trend for the society we are now, actually. So yeah, I'd like to see that. I'd like to see what that interaction was. What was the interaction like between these early pioneer farmers and the hunter-gatherers? What were the conversations? We sort of, we have no sense of what they were like. There's nothing in the archaeological record to suggest that it was violent in any way. So presumably it was quite a peaceful process, and that these, two different ways of life lived in parallel, side by side. But yeah, so that's what I'd like to see, please, if I may.
Jim, thank you so much for joining us. It's not only been a pleasure hearing your stories, hearing about your work, hearing about your career, but an absolute pleasure to meet you. And I'm so happy to have finally put a face to a name after hearing about you for so many years through mutual friends and colleagues. Your whole ethos in life and the whole way you've approached your career, it's given me hope. It's given me hope that not everyone needs to go down a jaded path, and you can find a way that leads to happiness and keeps the joy, and hopefully we can all pass that on to the next generation of students. It gives me such a positive feeling for the future, and I'm tremendously grateful for that. So that kind of leaves me to say to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for continuing to support us. Thank you to our small but very dedicated crew of Patreons who keep the bills paid on the podcast hosting fees. But please do go out and have a look at Footmarks. It's available in all good bookstores, and as I've discovered during the podcast, available on Audible in audiobook format. And I cannot wait to listen to it this next week and probably review it for the next podcast. Lawrence, what do you think?
That sounds like a mighty fine idea, and a mighty fine idea. Jim, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.